Thank you very much for inviting me to present to you. And thank you very much for the wonderful Indian Eagle. I mean, they've got to have a branch near me soon. Yeah, really good. We're lucky to have that restaurant. Now, can we be good without God? Well, think about this. The Christian God's backstory was only written about 6,000 years ago by the Jews, not the Christians. It's an obviously fanciful story, including a man made from dirt, a woman made from a rib, and a talking snake. Can that be a reliable source of information? And how did the inhabitants of planet Earth manage previously before that Bible was written? Without God. That's the answer. Because this question, can we be good without God, has two assumptions buried in it. Assumption one is the assumption that there is a God. And assumption two assumes there's such a thing as goodness. So, is there a God? Well, no evidence for any God has come to the attention of the members of Atheism UK. So the rational position is to be skeptical towards the claims of believers who merely assert that there is a God, that there is only one God, that it's their God, and that all the other gods are false. They do that without providing any evidence. The best they can do is construct arguments that there is a God. Now, arguments are mentally constructed cases. They're associations of ideas that can be refuted or debunked. And none of these arguments can actually be tested for evidence. They can't be investigated because the claim of God is immaterial. But nevertheless, they can assert that he exists, despite the fact that he doggedly remains hidden. So we should ask, can we be good without God, a reasonable question? To ask such a question. It's a Christian question. It's coming from a presuppositionalist position which barely applies outside that culture. If we do choose to accept the claim of the existence of a God, and I'm going to do that for purposes of this debate, the next question is, which God? Anthropologists estimate that these 18,000 different gods, goddesses, and various animals or objects have been worshipped by humans since our species first appeared maybe 300,000 years ago. There's even some recent evidence that chimpanzees in the wild may perform worship at altars and make offerings to them. Here's some of the gods. My favorites are not there. My favorite god is Unkulunkulu. He is the South African Zulu god. And my favorite goddess is Clavicina, who was responsible for keeping the civils of Rome free and flowing. Next question is, what is goodness? So, as you may have gathered from that wonderful intro that we saw, good and bad are sort of subjective value judgments, which are heavily influenced by the cultural perspective of the person doing the judging. They're not absolute or objective phenomena. And what is considered good in Islam is very different from what is considered good in Christianity, especially if you are female. So the terms good and bad only have local cultural relevance. And that's just the geographical accident of birth. Have you noticed how religions have spread out from a central source, a point of inoculation, in the same way that a bacterial colony does? This is a serious issue because religions divide humanity more than they bond it together. They divide it into antagonistic tribes who all each think they are right, they have possession of truth, the others don't. That is othering, that makes enmity. And this is all needless because, as I said earlier, no evidence for any God has been produced. Of course, I'm open to being shown such evidence, but please don't waste my time giving me arguments. Does the Christian God, this is the next question, have a monopoly on the supply of goodness? Does he dispense it to us mortals like this? Notice that, according to Michelangelo, God is depicted as white and man. Now, the first thing that we come to, if we're looking to discover whether God is dispensing goodness downward to us, the first problem we come up against is called the Euthyphro problem. And this was coined by Gottfried Leibniz to ask whether the condition of being good and just is good and just because it is intrinsically good and just, or is it good and just because God wills it to be so? If it's A, goodness is intrinsic, what's the point of God? He's just a postman collecting goodness from some mysterious source and delivering it to us. He's a Santa Claus with a sack full of goodness. He's the Amazon product fulfillment department. Do Prime members get next day delivery? Will the van driver leave it round the back if we're out? But if it's B, if God wills things to be good and just, then he could equally well dispense evil, but it will be labeled as good and just because it came from him. He'd be a mafia boss. Which is it? In fact, according to the Old Testament, God does perform evil actions. In Genesis, he even commits genocide, drowning the entire human population except for Noah's family. And there's numerous other examples in the Bible where God initiates, instructs, supports, or does not condemn activities that would be considered criminal in many civilized countries today. And first convincing us that we need saving, then offering us their salvation in return for our submission and money, isn't that a protection racket? Next, I want to ask you, are there any good atheists? What about Sir David Attenborough, Stephen Fry, Sandy Toxic, Ricky Gervais, John Lennon, Professor Alice Roberts? Some of you or your friends? Me? I like to think so. Thank you. In the recent surveys, the census 2021, 37% came out as non-believers, and in the British Attitude Survey, it was 52%. Isn't it offensive to imply that a majority of the UK are not good? And let's go abroad with that thinking. It show that the most criminal populations are the most religious, and the least religious nations are the least criminal. Let's go on to look at Christians. Can they be good with their God? Peter Farm priests, millionaire televangelists, prosperity gospelers. A London pastor recently was convicted of selling fake COVID cures to his congregation, £91 for a bottle of oil and red string. You heard right, oil and red string. He told them they could die of COVID if they didn't buy. If they preach being a good Christian but don't practice it, doesn't that make them hypocrites? And which Christians are we talking about? There's over 30,000 different denominations of Christianity. They all disagree with each other and often fight over who's right. What about badness? Can we be bad without Satan? What about not goodness? It's not childhood cancer. That's not good. So it must be Satan's work. Maybe we should start believing in the dead.
There it is. We have a big warm round of applause with Simon Edwards.
Brilliant. Well, good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and thank you for the kind invitation to what I hope will prove an interesting and enlightening debate. I have to say up front, thank you, John. That's not at all what I expected the approach that you would take. So we'll sort of work things out in our discussion time. But I'll just go with my opening statement anyway. So the question before us is, can we be good without God? Or to put it another way, can we be moral without God? Now, just to clarify, I don't take the view that only people who believe in God can be good. So John can be good, and most of my family can be good, and many of my friends can be good. So that's not the question. The question is not, can we be good without believing in God? The question is, can we be good without God? That is, would goodness or morality itself exist if God did not exist? Now, clearly, human beings, which I count this in the audience as clarifying that description, most humans are naturally moral beings. As the philosopher Alvin Plantinga once put it, it's extremely difficult to be a human being and not think that some things are right and other things wrong. For example, as an Australian living in Britain, I've observed that there is a particular moral issue that people over here are very much divided about, can get hugely emotional and worked up about. And the issue is this. When eating a scone, should one first put the jam on and then the cream, or the cream first and then the jam? As an innocent stranger from a foreign land, I've discovered that people can get very worked up about this, particularly from the West Country. I made the mistake of once asking what the right way to do this is, and was that a mistake? In an instant, British politeness left the room and good people started calling each other bad names. Because the thing is, each scone eating camp passionately believes that they're clearly right and the others are clearly wrong. Okay, let's turn from a humorous issue to a genuinely serious issue. If I were to ask you whether racism is wrong, my guess is you would all say, yes, it's wrong. I rarely meet anyone who believes otherwise. But when we say racism is wrong, what do we mean by saying it's wrong? Do we mean it's just wrong in the same way that someone would say putting jam first on a scone and then cream is wrong? No, that's not what we mean, is it? Because we realize that when we say racism is wrong, it's just not a matter of personal preference or social tradition. We mean it's always and everywhere wrong. In other words, not just subjectively wrong, but objectively wrong. Wrong, whether people believe it or not, and whether they like it or not. And the reason that we believe that some things are objectively wrong, like racism or child abuse or torturing innocent people, is that as human beings, we naturally and intuitively recognize the existence of an objective moral law for which we're all accountable. And interestingly, many thinkers and philosophers sound a bit like philosophers throughout history have argued that the existence of an objective moral law points to the existence of God as the only good explanation for that objective moral law. This type of argument is known in philosophy as the moral argument for God's existence, and it's considered a strong argument because in order to defeat it, you either have to deny that an objective moral law exists, or you have to explain how an objective moral law could exist without God, both of which are very difficult to do. The famous philosopher Friedrich Nietzsche was perhaps the most famous to deny an objective moral law. He reasoned that if God does not exist, there's no longer any objective reference for the universe deciding what's right and what's wrong, and therefore no objective moral law. In other words, he argued, paraphrased, if God is dead, all is permitted. And his philosophy, by the way, had a profound influence on the beliefs of Hitler. The atheist philosopher Jean-Paul Sartre made the same point. He said, if God does not exist, there disappears with him all possibility of finding values under an intelligible heaven. However, fewer atheists today are willing to deny the existence of objective moral law, not least because to do so would require one to affirm that racism or sexism or child abuse are not objectively wrong. Atheist philosophers today are more inclined to argue that there is an objective moral law, but that we don't need God to explain it. Perhaps two of the most popular attempts to explain the existence of an objective moral law without God are in terms of human decision or human evolution. So the first approach argues that human beings can create their own objective morality. We can decide for ourselves what's right and what's wrong. We can decide for ourselves, for example, that racism is wrong. But the difficulty with this view is explaining what ought to happen if someone else decides for themselves that racism is not wrong. Because on what basis can we tell a racist that they are wrong if we believe that human beings decide for themselves what's right and what's wrong? Do you see the problem? It's a problem highlighted by Friedrich Nietzsche centuries ago, which is that if you say that human beings get to decide what's right and what's wrong, the next question becomes which human being? Mother Teresa or Adolf Hitler? President Zelensky or President Putin? You or me? That's the problem. The second approach argues that we can explain morality in terms of human evolution. The argument being that because we've naturally evolved as social creatures, this is an adequate foundation for an objective morality. The problem with this argument, as the evolutionary psychologist Jonathan Haidt observed, is that the story of human evolution is not only the story of human beings being social with each other, it's also the story of human beings competing with each other and often violently. So, for example, the renowned anthropologist Claude Levi-Strauss explains that throughout history, some people groups have claimed we're the civilized, they are the barbarians, or we're descended from the gods and they've descended from the dirt, or we are the born to lead, they are the born to serve. And ironically, some groups have even used evolutionary theory to claim that we are the highly evolved and those other races, the lesser evolved. Another problem with trying to ground morality in evolution, as the atheist philosopher Barry Arnhardt pointed, is that we find among the list of universal human desires, which evolutionary biologists tell us are rooted in our human nature, the desire for war, and in men, the desire for dominance, neither of which represent a particularly promising foundation on which to establish a moral framework, particularly the desire for dominance, which would seem rather to legitimize such things as slavery and sexual oppression, which are activities that clearly violate morality rather than promote it. So, having looked at two of the most common attempts to explain an objective moral law in something other than God, human decision and human evolution, we've seen that neither of them are ultimately satisfactory. Now, all that being said, having listened to Mr. Rich's definition of morality, I'm not sure whether he believes in an objective morality at all. I'm not sure whether he believes that racism or child abuse or torturing innocent people is objectively wrong or merely a matter of personal preference. He did mention goodness being a subjective thing, so that's maybe something we can work out together as we discuss what is his views. But just to say, if one does believe in an objective morality, if one does believe that some things are really objectively wrong, that belief makes a lot more sense in a universe in which there is a good God at the heart of reality than it does in a blind and impersonal universe, as the atheist Richard Dawkins has described it, which has no design, no purpose, and no evil and no good, just blind or pitiless indifference. Because how would such a universe possibly provide a basis for an objective moral law? How would it not be anything more than just a meaningless machine? As the atheist philosopher J.L. Mackie famously pointed out, it would be very strange for moral facts that somehow just exist in an impersonal and purposeless universe in which everything ultimately reduces to the basic particles of physics. In other words, an objective morality makes best sense if God exists and good God exists. But how would a universe without God have an opinion about anything, let alone an opinion about how we ought to live our lives.
As it turns out, I predicted what Simon might be going to say rather well. So I have some slides to show you in response. First of all, I would take a bit of issue with his characterization of the options. He made out that it's a case of morals are either subjective or objective. Now, first of all, I want to know what he thinks subjectivity is. And objectivity, what is that? I have my view. I think that anything that's been through a brain comes out tainted by that brain's attitudes and experiences and cannot therefore be unbiased. In other words, cannot be 100% objective. So I think you're, what would be the expression here, casting at rainbows if you are seeking objectivity. And I contend that instead of it being a polar alternative situation, you can have a mixture. And my slides explain how. Where does good behavior lead from? Good behavior. Bear in mind that even if I had no answer to that question, it wouldn't make the God explanation true. But I do have an explanation. It's evolution and nurturing. Now, most people don't understand evolution. It's commonly believed that behavior can't be inherited. Those people should try herding sheep with a wolfhound. Have you heard of Velcro dogs? They're bred to be affectionate by crossing poodles with spaniels. As a result, they often suffer from separation anxiety. They can't bear to be away from their pack, their human tribe. All together now. So the truth is that social animals like us have become adapted to cooperate. We're not the biggest and most fearsome beasts, but working together, we can do things that species with lesser degrees of cooperation cannot. It didn't take goodness to build the Great Wall of China, or to send an autonomous helicopter to Mars. It took cooperation. That's what goodness is, cooperation. Now, Simon raised the possibilities of some people doing bad things. I contend that if you have evolved, do you know computer language? You know what a BIOS is? It's the piece of the chip that tells how to handle the other items that it's connected to, the other parts of the chip, like a memory or a printer, you know. We have a BIOS. We have evolved a BIOS. And in the case of this harming idea, it follows that deliberately harming an individual is counterproductive, since it will surely lose you their cooperation, and it will probably lose you the cooperation of their family and friends. Now, you can never be sure that the harm you're doing to an individual won't result in his death. And the dead don't cooperate. So that would be completely counter to the biological imperative of the survival and growth of the population. And remember, you only get decent cooperation from the willing. You can't force good cooperation. Slaves only do the minimum they can get away with. And I'd like to remind you that Simon's Bible doesn't object to slavery. So this empathic understanding of how to treat each other is an extension of behavior from our reproductive strategy. We're born helpless and we need to be cared for. That sets the tone for our culture, and we learn it by observation, by our experience as infants. So think about this. If you want people to cooperate with you, and you do, but that's what social animals need, their reputation, their behavior track record matters to you. And your reputation matters to them. So we get a sense of honor. Now, it's not just us. Lots of other mammals, birds, and members of some other phylum recognize cuteness and vulnerability and innately want to care for the possessors of it. That's it. It's nature and nurture. Equipped with some inherited behavioral traits, you might consider them to be parts of you, but they're in our subconscious. And we can override them on occasions if we think that's necessary with our conscious mind. For example, although we instinctively abhor killing, we might pause that rule to save a victim who's being strangled by a bully. We might attack the bully. Often asked, what stops someone from hurting a baby? Well, in case of individuals like that, it's the retribution that might befall the hurter from the infant's family and friends who have a vested interest in the survival of their offspring. Hopefully, they will grow into cooperators, a family labour force. Do you want the tribe to withdraw their cooperation? You may need them one day, so don't harm their babies. And of course, there's a range. Thanks to inheritance, we don't reproduce like photocopiers. There's variation. Look around you, there's variation. And that means not only are some people taller than others, cleverer than others, all differences, but some of them will be sociopaths. And it's a small number, less than 5% of the total population. Most of them are in the normal code of liking each other reasonably well. But we've constructed jurisdictions with laws, police, courts, and prisons for those outliers, outlaws. And we didn't need a God for that. Neither do we need a God to revise old laws or introduce new ones. Parliamentarians, lawyers, and judges do that with varying degrees of care and success. So another difficulty is that the single specific behavior doesn't always fit into the same category. Killing a human is usually bad, but it might be good if a sufferer from a painful terminal condition requests to be put out of their misery. So, behaviors are always contingent. They're responsive to unique incidents and specific circumstances, which due to the arrow of time can't come round again. So you can have some inherited principles, but you must allow for flexibility at the point of delivery of the action on each and every occasion. It's like abortion. It's not a matter of government interference, but for individual case-by-case decisions, judgments. It's simply inappropriate to have concrete rules. In regard to the commandments are not very good concrete rules anyway. So, a God, in my opinion, real or not, is simply irrelevant to our behavior. Like many social animals, we have evolved to be broadly congenial and cooperative towards each other. That is good or moral. What's evidence of this? It is in our enormous success as a species. We have a population of 7.8 billion individuals, and we've conquered practically all of the Earth's habitable environments, plus we are setting foot into space. It works. Sadly, for many centuries, the religious have attempted to steal our evolved heritage and to use it via the system of bogus rewards, afterlife, and harsh punishments in order to control us and milk us of our hard-earned money. Why do you think they do that?
Well, thank you very much for keeping the conversation interesting and lively. These are really important questions. Where to start? So I think we need to decide whether we say morality is subjective or objective. I think that you are trying to find a midway between the two by saying that things have to be contingent. And I agree that things are always contingent. They depend on circumstances. So as a lawyer by background, even case law that you mentioned, case law has principles which are objective. They're law written in cases based on precedents rather than legislation. But you can know what they are in advance. The thing is, what a particular law, how it might work out in practice will depend on situation and context. But that doesn't mean there isn't an objective law. It just means that an objective law will be applied differently depending on situation and context. And so, but there's still an objective law. So I still think we can't get away from the fact that you need to decide, do you believe morality is purely subjective or do you believe it's something objective? Do you believe it's something subjective, like if I feel it right now, or if I'm at a certain stage where most of the people around me sort of feel it now that this is right, that's the majority opinion, that's what is morality? Or is morality something that stands outside of where we're at now in majority opinion, like the law of gravity? It just is. I don't think that there's a middle way, but we can talk about that. In terms of trying to ground morality in evolution, philosophers generally take one of two approaches if we're saying evolution can give us insight into morality. The first approach is to say that an objective morality can be grounded in evolution. And I explained in the first session why that's why that has problems, why that's problematic. And the main reason is you can't just pick the fact that as human beings we cooperate with each other and say that's the evolutionary outcome that I'm going to pick, and I'm going to hinge all my morality on that, because that's not the only thing that evolutionary biology tells us about human beings. It also tells us that we naturally, as I mentioned, have a desire for war, and in men, the desire for dominance. Now, if you're going to just pick the cooperation bit and leave out the desire for war and the desire for dominance, on what objective ground above and beyond evolution are you making that distinction? That's probably right. But the other approach that philosophers will take in terms of trying to explain evolution, morality by evolution, is to say that actually there is no objective morality. It's just an illusion brought about by our genes, because our genes think that this is something that will help us to survive and to pass on our genomes to the next generation and the next generation. So an example of someone who would take this position would be the philosopher of science, Michael Ruse, R-U-F-E. And so he would say morality is just a biological adaptation. Any trying to look at a deeper meaning, i.e. an objective morality that sort of is outside of us, is illusory. It's just an illusion. And the well-known atheist biologist, Richard Dawkins has taken this view in the past when he was interviewed by a British journalist. And he agreed that the fact that we think sexual abuse is wrong is just as arbitrary as the fact that we've evolved 5 fingers rather than 6. In other words, it could have gone either way. It just went that way. So there is no objective morality. It's just arbitrary, like the amount of fingers on your hand. Okay? So those are the two approaches philosophers will take. I think, having listened to Mr. Richards and listened to previous videos to do a little bit of research, I think you take a third view, but please correct me if I'm wrong, and I could very well be. And on a video back in 2019 on the Atheism UK website, you define goodness as the property of a species being able to increase its population size. and not become extinct. And tell me if I'm wrong. Now, as far as I'm aware, there are not any serious philosophers who hold this position, who say that goodness just is the property of species being able to increase their population size. In other words, being able to replicate effectively. And the reason there aren't any serious philosophers who hold this position is for good reason. Reason number one, such an argument falls foul of a well-known fallacy in philosophy known as the is-ought fallacy, which holds that no amount of reasoning can get you from an is to an ought. That is, from a description of the way things are in the world, which is the province of science, to a prescription of the way things ought to be, which is the province of morality. But I think this is what Mr. Richards is trying to do, to argue from scientific fact that human beings can reproduce successfully to the moral claim that human beings ought to reproduce successfully, actually even more than that, to the moral claim that goodness itself means reproducing successfully. But not only is that a logically fallacious argument, it's also, I think, a very diminished understanding of morality, and not at all what most people understand morality to be. To say that morality is just a species increasing its population size and taking more territory, really? That's all morality is, increasing the population. Should we ask whether there is slavery or sexual oppression in the population as well, or does that not matter as long as we're successfully replicating our genomes and growing as a species? But it's just that. Isn't that the same description of what a virus does? Just replicate its genome over and over and over again. That's what viruses do. They're very good at it. But is that all that we believe morality is? I don't think so. To stick to some other views, I think you mentioned something like no human mind is objective, and then from there led to the conclusion that we can't have an objective morality. That you need to make a distinction. You can still have an objective morality, while it being the case that human minds may never get a full objective picture of what that morality is. It doesn't mean we can't get a very good understanding of what objective morality is, just as I believe that the laws of science are objective. It may very well be that I don't have a fully objective brain that can comprehend to 100% the objectivity of those scientific laws. It may be that if I fast forward 2 centuries and look back, our understanding of scientific laws is actually very inadequate compared to what it is in 2 centuries' time. But yeah, it didn't mean that there was no objective scientific law. In the same way, we might, from our skewed perspectives and background, always have different perspectives on what morality is, but it doesn't mean that there isn't an objective morality that we're all trying to work out. And of course, there are so many commonalities across the face of the planet that would suggest that there is an objective morality. Most things we do have in common, most moral beliefs we do have in common. To argue that because people have moral disagreements, there can be no objective moral law, would be to argue that because 2 people watching a game of football have disagreed about whether someone has committed a penalty, there can't be objective rules of football. Yet, of course, there can be objective rules of football. The only reason you have a debate about whether a penalty has been committed or not is if there are objective laws of football, which means that there is something to be right or wrong about when it comes to penalties. If there is no objective laws of football, you can't have a debate about anything, about whether a penalty was committed or not, because nothing objective point is your best marking, and in that case, it just comes down to who shouts the most and who's the most powerful, or who's got the most powerful Twitter account, or whatever it is. So, in summary, we're asking some really this does come down to some really important questions, which is, as human beings, do we want to say that some things really are right and really are wrong, irrespective of whether the law of the land said they're right, irrespective of majority opinion? There are some things, child abuse, etc., that will always be everywhere and always wrong, even if we stop believing it, and even if we don't like that morality, it just is the case. And where I sit, there really is an objective morality, and my belief that this universe is not here by accident, but here by design, makes sense of the fact that this is a moral universe. Because if there is a good God who created this universe, it would make sense that woven into the fabric of this universe, this good God created, is goodness itself, which we can all choose together to walk towards. And as I said at the very start, I don't believe we need to believe in God to be good, but I do think rationally and logically and metaphysically, we do need God in order for goodness itself. With this, thank you.